We're thrilled to have Rob on our call today, joining us, really planning some great content, kind of read through what he's planning to share. Can't be more relevant than now, what we plan to hear in his message. So a little bit about him, just real quick. Rob is highly accomplished global supply chain executive with extensive experience providing strategic vision and leadership to companies small, medium, and up to Fortune 500 level. He's got an impressive history of building agile technology-enabled supply chains, and really prides himself on forging high-growth partnerships, positioning organizations for success, and launching innovative technology solutions that improve end-to-end supply chain efficiencies. His background, besides currently being CEO and founder of Mercado Labs, is he served as vice president of global transportation for FedEx Logistics. Previous to that, roles of vice president of supply chain design at UPS Supply Chain, and spent time at Sears Holdings as the VP of transportation and director of transportation for Michael's Stores. I think I covered it all, Rob. I'll let you have the floor from here. I appreciate everything you're planning to share. I think you're a great addition to our speaker list this year, and certainly grateful for your time. So I'll let you take it away from here.
All right, thanks, David. So first of all, if anybody on the line knows me, they'll know that half of what you said is BS, and you're probably laughing at me right now. And for those of you who don't know me, that was probably written by someone else other than me, but I have been around a long time, so I've got that going for me, and I've seen a few things, and I hope I can share some of that with you today. You know, you see the theme here on this slide is be good, do good. So kind of the way I view the world right now, and I'm an optimist by nature, I'll start there, but I think we've got a unique opportunity to completely change the future. So, you know, what's happening with COVID-19 is exposing really how fragile the supply chain is, especially the international supply chain. But at the same time, it also provides an opportunity for us to have a fresh start. So I kind of looked at, like, you know, Humpty Dumpty's egg dumped over and there's 1,000 pieces, and how do we pick them back up? And so I'm going to talk today about three things. So my agenda is as follows. I'm going to start with a bunch of bad news. I'm going to start there because there's just a lot going on relative to COVID. So that'll be the first part of the agenda. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the supply chain first mile, what I call the first mile of the international supply chain, and some of the things that we're seeing there that are opportunities for us to improve upon. And then I'm going to wind it up with a few case studies, just different ways to look at this scenario right now. And my last one will be a real great example of a do good, be good company that we do business with. And I love to tell their story. So I've got about 8 slides here. I'll spend about 4 minutes on each roughly, and then leave some time at the end if there's any questions. I can't see anything other than the PowerPoint I'm looking at. So if you've got anything you need to note, if you could please route that through the chat through David, and he can stop me or ask me any questions. So without further ado, let me jump on into this first slide and talk a little bit about the negativity. And like I said, hopefully out of the negativity comes the opportunity to redefine what David calls the new norm, and what we can do better, and we can make not only great business decisions, I'm a businessman first, but also great decisions that serve, you know, people better and the planet better, because I'm seeing a lot of opportunities to do that right now. So this is just hot off the press. These are some fast facts from a survey that McKinsey just published. And here's the feature on it. It's on my LinkedIn if you want to take a look at it. And I also want to maybe do a little bit of an infomercial on our website. We've also got a seminar we recently did with the retailer that I mentioned, the case study at the end. So before I forget, you can watch that video there featuring the retailer, a couple really bright young people trying to change the world. So that's worth watching if you get a chance. But when I read this survey, I thought it'd be a good way to kick off this meeting. McKinsey put it together along with the Sourcing Journal. And Sourcing Journal, for those of us international, is another great place to get data. They really have a good handle on what's happening around the world. So just a couple plugs for them. The first thing, the first number on there, actually, this came from a different survey published the day before by Forrester. And it kind of just knocked my socks off. They're projecting that in 2020 alone, retailers are going to suffer a $2.1 trillion loss. And that's just a staggering figure. As importantly, if conditions are favorable, quote unquote, they'll be recovering in about 4 years to get back to the same levels they were at before COVID. So just super staggering. And as we think about the impacts of that in our business, a lot of our business depends on retail. Even if you're not directly involved in retail, the wholesalers that sell to retailers are equally impacted because obviously retailers are buying a lot less right now. I'll talk about that in a minute. But big blow to the retail industry, $2.1 trillion. What the survey goes into is a lot of the hits there were discretionary purchases. Those are the first to go. So discretionary goods, there's some bright spots, if you could call it that. Barbecue grills have gone up. People are cooking at home a lot more. Weights have gone up. People are trying to get themselves in better shape while they got a chance. And of course, groceries, things that are considered essential and maybe, appropriate for the times. But the discretionary things are getting clobbered. So when we think about things like fashion specifically, whether it's apparel or footwear, I think the statistics were something that it's down 26%. And I would expect that to get worse because those statistics were taken in March, and COVID really only started to shut everything down in the second week of March. So April will probably be even worse, but just some indication of how big that is. And I'm going to put that into further context because that's just how far their sales are down. Once their sales went down, we kind of lead in these next two bullet points. One is it meant that they had to either cancel outright or reduce the orders that they're placing on a forward bet basis. We're in a forward business, so for an international supply chain, meaning that our customers have to plan at least 4 months in advance. If it's apparel or footwear, sometimes it's much more. And so a bunch of them immediately went in and canceled orders. And the statistic in that article was just Bangladesh alone, a big apparel sourcing company, just that country alone estimates that cancellation is a $10 billion impact to their productivity. So big numbers. And then a lot of them that didn't cancel have reduced their orders. About 75% of them in the survey said that they reduced their orders, some by a significant amount. I think it was something like 42% said that they reduced their orders by half or more. And then there was a still big percentage that was 25% or more. So just thinking about that again in context, those are orders that would have shipped 4 months from now. So let's think about the August timeframe, which would normally be the peak season for us in international logistics. So if fashion is any indicator, it's going to be a slow peak season. So sort of thinking ahead here, just think about all the potential impacts to the business. And I said, I hate to start off with all this bad news. I'm an optimist, but we really have to think about what this is going to do for our business and what we're going to do differently while the pause button is pushed, because it's really been pushed right now, to be better as we push play again. So I'll focus the rest of my energy around that, but had to start with the level set of where are we at right now. And obviously none of this is great news, but it's the world we live in right now. So we'll deal with it and try to turn it into an advantage. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, when I talk about the first mile, defining the first mile that I talk about in international supply chains, a little bit different. If you're looking at the right side of the map, depending on which way you're looking at it, the US side, the first mile is relatively simple, right? Because you're placing an order to a supplier that's probably got their goods in stock. If all else comes to fail, you can pick them up and call them on a same or similar time zone, and you can get your product in a couple, 3 days. When you think about the first mile in the international world, everything is the opposite of that. So when you place your order, you're placing it not to something that's being pulled out of stock. You're placing your order for something that's going to be made to order. And a pretty quick turnaround on that production would be about 3 months. And then after your product is produced, then you got about another month before you can receive it versus say overnight parcel or whatever. If you air freight, it's still going to be 3 to 7 days. So you're looking at, roughly 120 days in time versus a domestic first mile, which might be a couple days in time. And then of course that production brings all kinds of complexity with it as well, because in the course of that 90 days going through production, all kinds of people are corresponding, buyers, sourcing people, financial people are corresponding back and forth to keep tabs on that order. So that's what I mean by the first mile. It's kind of that red circle there. And I kind of loop transportation into it. So I got about 90 days in there for basically manufacturing and production, purchasing, and then about another 30 days for transportation if it's moving by boat. So that's what I call the first mile. And The be good opportunity we have is a lot of those operations are highly, highly inefficient. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy that the people placing those orders have pretty sophisticated systems to help them plan the orders, tools like SAP and Oracle and JDA to some extent, NetSuite if they're smaller. However, when they send those orders overseas, the suppliers don't really have great systems with which to capture that order information. So a lot of the work has to sort of denigrate to analog or manual. And so it's a lot of Microsoft Office products. It's Excel and email and so forth that are managing that supply chain for 90 days during complex production, 8,000 miles away in a different language. So it's highly, highly inefficient. And when you think about a first mile, that's typically where your greatest leverage should be. When you think about a lever, if you kind of pull on the front end, you're going to get a lot more leverage for moving something than you will at the tail end. And so I kind of make the point here that once it's on a boat or a plane, there's not a heck of a lot an importer can do to affect the outcome. So what we really think about is how far upstream can we move in that first mile to make the operations more efficient. And so that's one opportunity to be good. There's a lot of efficiency opportunities. There's also a lot of risk. And so, you know, we tend to think of things in the logistics world, and a container is $3,000 and all the math that goes along with that. But the average container value in terms of inventory is about 50 grand. So pretty quickly, if you've got 1,000 containers, you're talking about $50 million worth of inventory that you've purchased, which you intend to sell for about $100 million. So you got tens of millions of dollars that are sort of in some great extent at risk if this supplier doesn't get the goods done on time, or there's problems with the goods when they arrive here. All that inventory is at risk. So there's also a risk mitigation play that I see in the first mile that we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then the last thing is what I'm seeing lately, and I'll do this case study at the end, is there's also a big environmental and human impact that we haven't been able to get our arms around too well because of this manual nature of it. So we talk a pretty good game, and there's a lot of standards out there in terms of making sure that you're trying to treat the environment and people well. But it's really difficult to enforce because there's not really enough technology, there's not enough digitization in place to really kind of enforce all that. So there's also an opportunity here as we rebuild this thing to do good. And frankly, that's my why. That's what I'm most interested in. So I'm excited to talk about that case study at the end there. Okay, so let's go into just a little bit more detail. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but this is kind of what the supply chain looks like today. And I mentioned the Microsoft Office, and I also mentioned the time. And what you're seeing here across the first mile is that it's not managed by systems. And I'm going to show you in a minute a slide that's going to kind of blow your mind in terms of the complexity. But thinking about managing all of that time, all that processes with this scenario, I just wanted to paint this picture for you, which is Excel, email. In some cases, believe it or not, people are still using fax machines is kind of amazing, but that's the way it is in many cases, especially with the countries that we're purchasing product from. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This is the one that'll blow you away, and I don't expect anybody to read this slide. You can have a copy of it if you're interested in it, but the reason I put this up here, at Mercado, we think a lot about the importance of connectivity and bringing together sort of the right people with the right processes and the right tools and technology. And so you can't succeed really without any one of these three components. And that's why it's so important that we do more than just technology. So what I'm going to illustrate in this slide here is all of the things that have to come together for things to work right. And so you're going to see in the first column, a lot of different business entities have to come together for things to arrive correctly, starting with the customer, going through the suppliers. A lot of times the suppliers outsource to factories. They use providers, whether it be freight forwarders or inspection companies or packaging companies. There's government agencies involved both in your origin country and in your destination country. And of course, you have to transport it. So you've got carriers involved. Then you got a lot of different departments within these companies that got to come together, a lot of different functions and a lot of days. And I've sort of summarized all that in that yellow bucket down there on the right, how many things need to come together in order for this to work right. And so what I always kind of share with people at this point is if you look at this thing, and it's complicated intentionally because that's really what it is, and you think about all these variables that have to come together, it's kind of amazing that anything actually shows up here in the first place. And it does primarily today because of a bunch of heroes, right? People working just extraordinary hours or gaining 20, 30 years of experience on how to overcome this. And that's sort of how it works today. And so it works, it's just not great. And so as we digitize this, we can think about, with computerization, obviously, putting all of these elements into one database and using the logic of the computer to manage a lot of these things for us. So that's really what our intention is. So I wanted to show you the first mile complexity. And as again, the case studies, I'll dive into that a little bit deeper, but this is really what the first mile of a supply chain looks like. And it's kind of daunting, as you can see. Okay, some of the challenges that we see when we think about the first mile challenges, in the first 120 days, you know, how do you think about predictability is one big issue. And so predictability is, I'm going to place an order, today's May the 5th. So let's say I placed an order on May 1st, and I'm expecting it to arrive on August 1st, and it better because I'm getting ready for my back to school season. So what are all the things that have to happen in order to make sure that it does arrive by August 1st and I can make back to school? And so predictability is a big challenge for most people because they're not connected to that first 90 days. Lots can go wrong. If you're buying red yarn, the red ink supply may run low, or there may be a change in style and it, you know, massively backlogs the production, or there may be a big run on a certain item and all of a sudden it's in short supply. So it's pretty hard to track predictability with Excel and email for sure. And so there are tools that are needed for that. I talked a little bit about the exposure that people have when they're sort of blind to some extent to what's happening on the origin side, both from an efficiency standpoint, an inventory standpoint, a sales standpoint, but also that human impact I spoke about. And then speaking of efficiency, I think we've all made this adjustment, and COVID's a good example. You know, I think about things like I ran into last fall, I was in China and I ran into 9 buyers from a major retailer here in Dallas. And I think about that now, it seemed totally normal to me at the time. They're at a restaurant and kind of catching up on their day, probably exhausted. But now I wonder, you know, would we still send 9 people over to Asia to check on things for us? Just that trip alone probably cost $100,000 between tickets and so forth. Also time out of the office and so forth. And was that the most efficient use of our resources? We have the technology now, we're seeing this all over the country, that we could probably do a lot of that stuff that we used to have to hop on an airplane and fly 8,000 miles, 16 hours away to do. Maybe we can use technology to become more efficient across the board. And then this transparency piece, as long as I've been in this business, there's been sort of a natural desire by a lot of people to be opaque about processes for whatever reason. You know, they didn't want to disappoint a customer, or they didn't necessarily want to reveal some of the things that were happening behind the scenes. But in the world we live in today, the more transparency we can get, the better. And it's not like the old days. It's not like there's a need for opaqueness anymore. It's fairly easy to find things out. So if you can put some bright lights in the dark corners of your supply chain, then that's obviously going to be a good thing to get more transparent. On the collaboration piece, when we did some surveys, we found that up to 30 different people need to come together on each and every order. And that sounds impossible until you start thinking about the accounting department needs to be involved because I've got to match up the purchase order, the commercial invoice. The factory needs to be involved. The supplier needs to be involved. Finance needs to be involved. Obviously, logistics needs to be involved. Buyers, merchandisers, all of those people at some point are touched by that order. And so how do all those 30 people get connected today? And so going back to those inefficient tools, people try to use email, but sure, they forget certain people. And so all of a sudden there's a surprise because somebody wasn't on copy of the email. Just not a good way to run a business. So we need more collaboration. And then the last piece is automation. You know, as I looked at the first mile from my perspective, the thing that really hit me, and it sort of hit me for a long time, was that order that's placed, and a lot of care goes in that order, it's placed electronically. So I thought, what if we could keep that order digital? What if we could use that atomic purchase order and connect each element on that purchase order all the way throughout the supply chain? Because really there's nothing else. The order is going to tell us when it's supposed to ship, how many are supposed to ship, what the styles are going to be, what the price is going to be. So if I could just keep that data intact and I could track it, then I could create the commercial documents electronically. I wouldn't need to have the supplier produce those. And I could feed that information maybe to the regulatory department at a customs broker so they could do their entry more efficiently. And maybe I could feed that data to the accounting department so they didn't have to do a three-way match. So I think a lot about automation and how do we remove some of these steps and digitize them so we can make the whole supply chain more efficient. So those are the challenges we see and that we think need to be addressed in order to make the first mile more efficient. Okay, go to the next slide. So I'm going to start with a case study here because I think this really even more so hammers home the point of how complex the supply chain is. This is a retailer that I'm not doing business with today, but did business with extensively in my last job. They're based in Philadelphia, and I won't say the name of them, but they're killing it right now. Their business, COVID's impacted their business like everybody else, but their business overall has really taken off, and they grew like crazy. And so when they started engaging us, we started to sort of keep some statistics for them. And these numbers I'm going to give you, you can think about as multiplication tables, because that's the complexity goes up exponentially. So the first thing we discovered was that they said they had 300 vendors. That was true, but what they didn't know is on top of the 300 vendors, they also had 768 factories. So what that meant was some of their vendors were subbing out the work to factories unbeknownst to them. The people producing their goods were blind to them. So if we start to say 768 factories, 300 vendors, that's math. It's 768 times 300 you got to keep track of. They place about 20,000 purchase orders a year. And so now you got another mathematical, take those first two times 20,000. They purchase about 75,000 unique products from 6 origin countries to 3 destination countries. And that all translates into about 10,000 containers. So if you do that math, I can't do that in my head, but if you do that math, it's millions of possibilities and permutations of that data that needs to be connected, collected, collaborative, transparent, all those things I said on the first slide. And it's nearly impossible to do with Excel and email. And so what you see there in the middle is, what if you could put a platform, and obviously it's a little bit self-promotional there, but what if you could put a platform in the middle to say, I'm going to keep track of all that data on my orders electronically, and I'm going to put all the supplier and factory information in there, all the product information in there, all the shipment information there. So you've got all your data sort of in one place. I'm looking at my time here. You've got all your data in one place, and everybody that's involved with it, all 30 people, can go onto the same place and collect that data. And again, the computer can kind of help you normalize all these incredible volume of numbers in one spot. So that's just one example of a case study. So I can kind of show you what, if you're sitting in a retail chair, a big importer chair, what that looks like for you. It's like I said, it's kind of insane that it even works. But there's one case study. Let me give you another one from a different perspective. I'm hearing a lot of things these days about, Rob, you keep talking about all this complexity. Wouldn't it be a lot easier if we just moved all this stuff back to the US, right? And I can't disagree with that. It'd be certainly easier from a complexity standpoint, but there's a bunch of reasons why it may not move back anytime soon. And regardless of which side of the political aisle you are, I'm an American too. I'd love to see jobs come back here, but I'm going to give you this case study as a different angle on that to say why it may not be as logical or as easy as people think. So this is a case study on a company that ships something that probably most of you use every single day a lot. You carry it in your car, you carry it in your hands, and you talk on it. And this company is both a retailer and a wholesaler, and they make all of their product in China. And not just China, they make it in the middle of nowhere, China. It's like China's equivalent of Minneapolis, basically. And all of their product is assembled in 2 cities in the middle of China. So you could say, wow, and it's a ton of jobs. It's like it's north of 400,000 jobs assembling that product. And so you could easily say, wow, that'd be great if we brought those jobs back here. And so I just want to give you some other things to think about as we think about whether supply chains are going to just shift and it's going to be as simple as turning one off and turning another on. So the first statistic there is this company sells tons of products, and the US is their #1 market, but their #2 market is China. And so from their perspective, is it going to make any more sense to make them here and send them back to China? Could they bifurcate their supply chain and maybe make some here and some there? Lots of decisions to be made. But it gets more complex than that. It's not just where they sell the product, because they actually sell it worldwide. China happens to be the #2 market, but they sell it all over the world. And so there's really complicated logistics when you start going into where do you sell all your product on the global demand side. But the other thing is, where does the supply for those products come from? So I mentioned that they're doing assembly in China, but the components that go into those products are supplied from 17 different countries, including the US. So 6 of the suppliers that they have for their products are US based and shipping products to China. A bunch of them are in China or somewhere else in Asia, and then some of them are in Europe. And so I just wanted to lay this out there a little bit so that when we start having this conversation, as many will, about our supply chain is going to shift, are we going to reshore, are we going to nearshore? From a logistics standpoint, again, I won't get into politics, but from a logistics standpoint, it's not as easy. There are certainly a lot of economic reasons as well that I'll just touch on briefly. You know, I always wonder, are people going to change their buying behaviors and be willing to pay more for product? Because for sure the cost of the product will go up. Will shareholders suddenly get more tolerant and accept lower margins? Tough to say. There's some environmental impacts, especially of this product and many others. And so will the people who in this country who are concerned about those things relax the environmental and labor regulations to the same extent? So those are all questions that need to be answered. My point here is just simply that global supply chains are incredibly complex beasts. And if you ever get a chance, I'll just recommend a video. I've sent it on my LinkedIn post, but there's one called iPencil that I just love. It's a 5-minute video. And you think about something simple like a pencil. And when you see this video, it talks about all the different things that need to go into making a pencil. And obviously we produce and we ship a lot more complex things than a pencil. So just keep that in mind. I think global trade is safe, at least for my lifetime, if not longer. So I just want to give you some perspective on that. And then I want to end this with the time I've got remaining, which is 4 minutes. I'm almost right on track, with a case study. And I mentioned this is on our webinar as well. And what I want to show you here, and I just love this slide, even though this is busy too, I think I can talk you through it. This is a retailer called Public Habit, and the 2 founders of it are some really bright young people, as I mentioned, that both spent, I think, 7 or 8 years at Amazon. And they came across sort of an amazing statistic, amazing in a bad way. The number is, we purchase as Americans 150 billion garments a year, 150 billion garments a year. And what they learned was that about 30% of that goes straight to a landfill. It's not even purchased. It's just going straight into a landfill, because we've all sort of gotten hooked on fast fashion and people are consuming stuff. And the international supply chain is very, very long. So these people that are, trying to meet these trends are trying to plan a year in advance. And sometimes they get it really right. Sometimes they get it really wrong. When they get it right, they sell like hotcakes. And when they get it wrong, they got nothing to do with that product. It's, the wrong season. It's the wrong time. It's the wrong style. It's the wrong all kinds of things. Trends have changed. And so 30% of apparel goes straight into a landfill. So they've built their business, publichabit.com, on the notion of, well, couldn't we do it differently? And time will tell whether their model's going to work, but I'm going to applaud them for trying either way. They sort of flipped it on its head and they said, well, what if we did it a different way? And we waited until we got the order from the customer, and then we place the order with our supplier, and then we ship it. And that would mean some things would be different. Will consumers pay a little bit more for the product because they're going to have to? And will they wait? I mean, are people going to change from wanting that product at 7 p.m. tomorrow night on Amazon, or can they wait 2 weeks for it to get to them? And so there's some open questions on this, but I'm going to walk you through from a supply chain perspective how different this is and how different this model is. And so in a typical apparel environment, like I said, you got to do a lot of things, and it takes overall about a year, but you got a ton of stuff on the planning side. And so you're sitting there trying to think of strategic trends. People, sometimes buyers of fashion, even fly to Europe first and see what Europeans are wearing, because usually they're more trend forward than we are. And so they do all kinds of things to try to predict the market for this really long supply chain. Then they've got to manufacture it, which is the second bucket there. And manufacturing of apparel is some of the hardest thing to do. And so that takes a long time as well. Typically in apparel, it takes about 6 months to produce stuff versus the 3 months I was giving you average earlier. Theirs takes even longer. And it's because there's so many complexities in apparel, things you don't think about, how many buttons on the shirt, what color is it, what's the fabric, all the different sizes, all the different colors, endless permutations that go into fashion, and they got to all be perfect. And so it's really complicated to plan, and it's really complicated to manufacture. Then of course you've got transport, and then the last piece is demand. And so most of these folks are bringing into some kind of a distribution center somewhere, and then they're allocating it out to either, retail stores or to their customers or e-commerce or whatever. So that's taken about a year. And as I mentioned, public habit sort of flipped it on its head, and they're basically saying, we're going to take your order first. We're going to place exactly the demand that we have with our suppliers. The suppliers are going to produce it, and we're going to ship it to you, to your home directly. So they're cutting out the distribution, they're cutting out the forecasting. They've selected suppliers that have more advanced manufacturing capabilities so they can produce it faster. And that's their model. And so the reason I'm talking so much about them is it's an example of, be good, meaning look at how much more efficient their supply chain is than the one on top. And this is the way almost every apparel company does it today. Look at how much more efficient it is. So you're going to be good if you can do things this efficiently. And really everybody's now got a chance to look at their supply chain and see if they can do it more efficiently. And these guys have totally flipped it on its head. But even if you cut out half of that, it'd be significant. And then they've also taken the extra step, means my time's up. Hang on one second here. But what that also means is if they succeed in their mission, and I hope y'all will support them, that they can also do good, because if we can take 50 billion garments out of the environment, that's a big deal. And I hope that's the case. Like I said, we'll see over time, but that would be a big deal. So they've got a dual mission of doing good, of making a whole new play towards how you manage your international supply chain, and also being good by helping the environment. And so that's sort of my last pitch. I'm a little bit past time. My last pitch is, I would encourage everybody on this call who's listening right now to think about this, what I've kind of walked you through in terms of how complex this thing is, and to some extent how antiquated it is. You can see I'm old, and it's been really the same way ever since I've been doing it. It's been frustrating for me because I could tell that it was inefficient. We just didn't really have the tools and or the impetus to do things differently. But now we got a fresh shot, guys. Everybody can look at things differently. Every retailer is going to have to rebuild. Every fashion company is going to have to rebuild. Not everyone, but most of them are going to have to rebuild. And when they rebuild it, just hope we can give them some good guidance, or if you're an importer yourself, if you'll think about this, to maybe rethink how you're doing it, and can you assemble the parts differently than they've been assembled before? Because we don't have to keep doing things the same way if we don't want to. We may choose to, but we do have the ability now. The technology's progressed, the demand's checked, the awareness is checked, to say that we could do it differently. And if you could do all that, and then on top of it, you could think about how you could do some good for humans and the planet, better yet. And that's why I want to end with this story. That's really, for me, that's the biggest win-win if we can do both. Let's do a better job as logisticians and supply chain experts. And then let's see if we can help companies also think more about people and the planet. Okay, that's my time. And let's see, I'm going to just end this. Well, I'll just leave this up here. Last thing here, David's back. Okay, good. Just make the pitch that we're Mercado, and there's our website, and there's my email. So if you need anything from me, I'm happy to help.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that.
Yeah, sure.
Couple questions came in, and that's an interesting number about the waste in the textile business. I had no idea. Is that
scary, isn't it? Yeah, no, me either.
Going to landfills. Cool case studies. We had a couple questions come in. Wanted to throw them at you. First one, kind of, it's a good one that's really relevant, especially if you hear people taking the recycling to the curb these days. Are you seeing any preliminary numbers about what the alcohol supply chain's doing differently and behaving differently than maybe some of the other supply chain networks and demand right now?
Well, I can only give you a personal experience. If I'm any judge, it's going up. It's doing quite well. It's like a lot more time on my hands. And I don't know if you all are doing this, but I'm attending a lot more virtual happy hours. So I'm actually doing more happy hours than I did in the physical world, because everybody can, make those things happen pretty easily. I can't really speak to alcohol supply chain very specifically. I know a little bit about it because I had a customer who used to purchase a lot of tequila from Mexico. But for the most part, I haven't had much experience in alcohol supply chains. So I can only speak to the demand. And I have read the statistics that alcohol sales are way up. So that's one industry that's benefiting from all this mess, unfortunately.
Well, there's another question kind of dovetailing, I think, more on the first two case studies. And I think we all kind of know the shift in manufacturing, but one of the questions, are you seeing a notable shift in product sourcing away from China, without getting political, obviously, even more emphasized by what's happened with coronavirus, in addition to maybe stacking on top of what the influence of the tariffs were? Has anybody started shifting their networks purely due to the virus that you've seen?
Yeah, and I probably should have said this when I was going through my agenda, but COVID, in my mind, is like the fourth hit in a row to the international supply chain, right? So it started about 3 years ago. I think President Trump was in office about 2 days when he picked a fight with Xi. So we started off trade wars. That led into tariffs. And that, to your point, or to the question's point, led to people looking for alternative place to source, because obviously people were fearful with the trade war and increased tariffs that their price was going to go up, and they looked for alternatives. So there was a big push in the last year or two to look for alternatives. What I'm hearing is that some product was able to shift, particularly in garments and footwear. And if you look at the trends on those two products, they've done they had already been in those places, and they've done a job to push it even greater percentages. A lot of people have stayed, and it sounds illogical, but when you look at the alternatives, whether it's nearshoring, we look in this hemisphere, or even the United States, or you look at somewhere else in South Asia, China's got some huge advantages that are economic, and they're tough to overcome. So as they started building their infrastructure, it wasn't just the factories. They made sure the factories got more productive, but also the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers moved to China to be near those tier 1 factories. And they also made huge investments in infrastructure. So the roads there, the trains there, the ports there, everything runs super efficiently. So it's one of those other things, is just picking up and moving from China isn't just a matter of saying, I'm going to manufacture in Thailand versus China for whatever reason. You also have to think about, can they produce garments as quickly in Thailand as they can in China because of productivity issues? Do those Thailand suppliers have the raw material suppliers, the cotton suppliers, the thread suppliers, the ink suppliers near them to be able to get all the goods that they need? They have enough workers. People talk about Vietnam as being a place, there's 100 million people in Vietnam, there's 1.4 billion in China. So they have enough labor to do it, and so forth. So there's huge complexity. So I think, to the question, everybody's looking at it for all the right reasons. And I think some people are drawing the conclusion that for the short term, they're probably going to keep their production in China, at least in some manner. And they're going to continue to look for ways to diversify further. But China has got some very unique structural advantages that are going to be awfully hard to replicate. And so we sort of need to just come to grips with that. Now, I think where everybody's really scared these days, I'll just mention that, is that some of those products that are essential to our well-being need to be diversified at any cost. So we certainly can't have pharmaceuticals not available to us, or PPE and those kind of things. But I don't know that anybody really thinks cotton T-shirts are an essential good for the U.S. And so probably we'll look at it that way, and we'll continue to make decisions to be diverse and resilient. But I would just caution anybody to bet against China in terms of its prowess in terms of manufacturing. They're quite good, especially on the low end stuff. We're still better than them. If anybody's too really patriotic on this, we're still better than them in the high tech stuff. We still make better airplanes and better technology and better bunch of things. But in the low end stuff, they're pretty darn good, I have to say.
Great.
Hopefully that answers the question, David.
Yeah, that's great. It's a very dynamic shift that really doesn't have a definitive answer, to be honest. I mean, based on
it doesn't. It's a work in process for sure.
Yeah. Well, kind of one last question. I think really, so earlier in the year we had FedEx's kind of in-house blockchain SME Dale Christie join us. Kind of shared
okay.
what they're doing with. I don't know if you know Dale, but he's got a really cool kind of insightful perspective on blockchain. You know, without maybe going down a rabbit hole, because I'm sure you know a ton about it from your perspective. Maybe what's going on with blockchain and like PO and supply chain planning networks? I know you're doing a lot to kind of vertically integrate some of the layers. Where does blockchain come in? Are we 5 years? Are we 10 years away? Are we 1 year away? I mean, what do you see in the influence there?
Yeah, you know, it's you know, so I'll start with saying, like, technology is great, and some technology is going to just come in and replace everything we do, and so there won't be a transition from one to the other. And blockchain has that sort of potential for transformation. But what we see in most technologies is that not just a sweeping transformation, there's an evolution. We move from one thing to the next, And because of what I just described in international supply chain, I think we're a ways off in blockchain, because we're still dealing, as I just showed you in those case studies and that really complex chart, we're still dealing with Excel and email. So we have some ways to go in terms of upgrading just to even what we would consider to be normal technologies. And then there's a lot of opportunities to improve just with normal technologies. So like I talk about automation, you know, one of the simple things is automating the documentation process. And we don't really need to go through any migration to blockchain to do that. We can eliminate the need for that altogether just by digitizing the PO. So I think blockchain is coming. I think it's going to be a while before they can assemble all the different parties to keep that ledger straight in an international supply chain, because of the reasons we've got China government, US government, ocean carriers, freight forwarders. There's just so many people that have to come together to agree on those standards and who's going to keep the ledger and who's going to be ultimately responsible for it. Plus, it's so analog. It almost needs to have a couple more steps technology-wise before we can go that full-blown and just put it out there on an automated ledger. So if I had to guess, I would tell you 10 years, and I think that might be optimistic for just this piece of the business. I think other parts of the supply chain are ripe for it, and that'll happen in the next couple of years. And there's some big companies behind it, pushing it, particularly on the ocean carriage side and bills of lading and things like that. But on the international purchase order side, I think it's going to be a ways off. It's complicated, and it's analog.
Yeah. So, I mean, $75,000 product line with one of your case studies was prime example. I mean, how do you standardize that?
Yeah.
Across the board.
Yeah, exactly. And so many different industries and SKUs and so forth, but we'll get there. I'm convinced of that, but I may be doing something different by now.
Well, great, Rob. I appreciate the perspective. I think if anybody has any final questions in the next 10 seconds, we're going to kind of close out here. I'm going to plug you a little bit just because I've followed you on LinkedIn for a few months, and gosh, probably over a year. You issue kind of I guess the title is "What I Learned in International Supply Chain This Week" that you publish out there. I thought that's pretty cool. Maybe somebody, the people joining us today, maybe can follow you on there and get some additional perspective, kind of real time what you're seeing. I think that's a really cool thing you do on LinkedIn and social media.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I really love that. I've been doing this long enough that it's well past time for me to contribute whatever I can. So I'd really love for you to follow me, but more importantly, if you've got any questions, shoot me back a note, and I'd love to engage further. So any way I can help, I'm happy to. Great.
Well, Rob, I appreciate you joining. On behalf of the Memphis World Trade Club, we generally, I like to do this in person in luncheons, but in honor of your participation today and joining us and sharing, we're going to give a donation to St. Jude Children's Hospital in your name.
Nice.
So we appreciate that.
Great cause.
I'm handing that to you virtually. We'll get that to you in the mail.
I'll take it. Thank you.
Looks like we had a pretty captive audience the whole time. We didn't lose many people. And your contact information is below. And no further questions. We'll go ahead and close out. Have a great week.
David, thank you. And thank you all for participating. I wish I could see you all, but I can't. So thank you for everybody who joined. And again, my contact information is there. Love to stay in touch.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.